Greetings, one and all, and in Darug, the Sydney language, Warami, which means good to see you. I begin by acknowledging the First Nations of the country we now call Australia and their custodianship of the land over tens of thousands of years. For Australia has never been terra nullius, nobody's land. May we listen to God's wisdom, which the original inhabitants of this continent have been cherishing through the eons. I am Dr. Kostake, an associate professor of theology at the Sydney College of Divinity, in which capacity I chair the Theology Research Network, TRN, as well as the ISCAS Research Director. It is my pleasure to host the 5th TRN ISCAS seminar this year, which, mind you, will take a different format from the usual paper and response one. The speakers, Professor Lisa Sideris and Professor Margaret Somerville, know each other since many years and have agreed upon a more colloquial approach, but let me introduce them. Lisa is Professor of Environmental Studies with affiliation in Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on the ethical significance of natural processes and environmental values as they are captured or obscured by narratives and perspectives from religion and the sciences. Her most recent work considers the interplay of religion and technology in emerging ethical issues in the Anthropocene. She is author of Environmental Ethics, Ecological Theology and Natural Selection, 2003, and Consecrating Science, Wonder, Knowledge, and the Natural World, 2017. She has also written extensively on environmental pioneer Rachel Carson and co-edited an interdisciplinary collection of essays titled Rachel Carson, Legacy and Challenge, 2008. She currently serves as the president of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. In turn, Margaret, or Margot, is professor of bioethics at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and at McGill University, Montreal. Emerita Samuel Gale Professor of Law, Emerita Professor in the Faculty of Medicine, and Emerita Founding Director of the Center for Medicine, Ethics, and Law. She has received 8 honorary doctorates, was the first recipient of the UNESCO Avicenna Prize for Ethics in Science, awarded by an international jury, has an extensive national and international publishing and speaking record, and is a frequent commentator in all forms of media. Her most recent book is Bred on an Ethics Wire, Battles About Values in the Culture Wars, 2015. Among many other honors and awards, Professor Somerville received the Order of Australia in 1991 for her contribution to bioethics, became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 1990, a Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales 2022, and was made a Dame of the Order of St. Gregory the Great by Pope Francis in 2020. We are very privileged to have them both talking to us, and I'm very grateful for they agreeing to meet us, the little family. Now, Lisa will give us a brief introduction to the topic, and then self and Margot will talk to the slides for the rest of the first hour of our seminar. After that, we'll have a break of 10 minutes or so, and then the speakers will take questions. Today's topic, Undying Love, religious and ethical perspectives on pet cloning, might not have much to do with the tragedies that currently unfold in the world, but illustrates well our first world concerns. Above all, it fits the bill of this 2-year cycle of TRN ISCAS seminars. So let's listen to Lisa's introduction.
Thank you. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about, just to give some context and summarize some of my own views of this topic, which is kind of the first time I have really closely examined this topic. So it's not something I've been working on for a while, but I think there's some parallels to other topics that I have been working on. So like many people, I just kind of came across pet cloning I guess, kind of by chance and sort of in the wake of a couple of the deaths of my own pets, actually. And so a documentary that I saw that I'll mention in a moment that featured some scenes of the pet cloning industry was kind of enraging to me, actually. I was really quite struck by it. In fact, and it was partly my venting about this that I was persuaded to maybe write a paper about this, which is often the way I end up writing things, I think, is when I feel very piqued by them. So I mean, one of the questions that I'm really interested in then is, what is a pet and what do we owe them, both in life and in death? How should we honor pet deaths, and what sort of practices properly enshrine our love for these creatures? So pets are often defined by three particular criteria. They have a name, they live in the home at least some of the time, and they are not eaten, at least not by the humans that live with them. The human-pet relationship grew out of something much more utilitarian when animals that were domesticated for, work around the house, to protect the house, or to, in some cases, like, as you know, your dog will clean up your garbage if your dog gets hold of it. So, dogs and pigs are scavengers, and so they were often used to tidy up, really, and to, protect the house. But over time, that sort of utilitarian relationship, although it never ceased to be entirely utilitarian, became one of affection, as animals were sort of singled out as favorites. So from among animals that might be either born on a farm or, some sort of domesticated animals, there were certain ones that were chosen. So there's an idea about pets that there's something singular about them, that they are distinguished from others around them. So I want to, think more about that idea of singularity as defining a pet. The pet cloning industry has sort of two hubs. One of them is in Texas, and the other one is in South Korea. And the South Korean facility, which was one of the first place actually to clone pets, the chief scientist there is a disgraced stem cell scientist who was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. He falsified his data. He claimed to have cloned human embryos and then, got stem cell lines from them. He was barred from continuing his stem cell research, but not from cloning pets. And he's also pursued efforts to de-extinct woolly mammoths. And so in the documentary that I mentioned at the outset, it's called Genesis 2.0. You can see he, along with Harvard geneticist George Church, who's very interested in de-extincting extinct animals, bringing them back from the dead, have also, they're teaming up using some of the same technologies. So if you think of sort of what someone's trying to do when they're cloning a dog and what they're trying to do when they de-extinct an organism like this, I think there's some very interesting parallels. So, and I'll come back to those in a moment. But in terms of the welfare issues, it takes many, many animals to create one clone, both as egg donors and as surrogates. Both animals, the donor and the surrogate, they're not really, willingly donating, but the egg donors are often injected with hormones. The births are often by C-section, and the cloned offsprings often have many malformations or anomalies. That's true of clones in general. They sometimes have shorter lifespans. And when they are successful, there's often more than one clone created, more than the client wanted. And so in that case, we don't really know what becomes of these extras. And in general, in fact, the reason that South Korea had the first successes with pet cloning is because it's almost completely unregulated. There's no oversight of the treatment of animals, which are often procured from dog farms and housed potentially by the hundreds. We don't know actually how many there are in some of these facilities. So the author of a book called Dog Inc. refers to this as mass production by brute force. To produce the one clone that was the first created pet clone in 2005, it took 1,100 embryos and 123 surrogates to produce 3 clones, 2 of which died, only 1 of which lived. And, cloning has gotten better over the years in terms of the successes, but it's still a pretty inefficient way of creating something. So theologian Stephen Webb has a book called Of God and Dogs, which I first discovered as a graduate student and hadn't thought about for many years until I came back to it recently. He talks about the pet relationship as one of excess and extravagance, and he means that in a positive sense. Although pets are bought and sold, in an important sense, they reside outside of or exceed the economic order, he says. They are more gift than property. And he means gift in a theological sense as well, in the sense of grace, something that is given that is undeserved. Pets evoke a recognition of an animal reality independent from the human world. Although dogs and other animals stretch human imaginations, they are not wholly other. Rather, he says, their difference from us is both distant and intimate, drawing us out of ourselves toward that which we can never fully know. Pets, and particularly dogs, for Webb, present themselves to us as gifts, something that is undeserved and yet beneficial, inspiring an uncalculated response. That's a quote from him. So this is what he calls a theology of excess, of extravagant, different difference. They're not just more of us. They're not just more loving or more excessive or exuberant. They're actually different. It's a different difference, he says. So a theology of excess in which more is received than is given. Another way he puts it is that they give us more than we can possibly buy. Of course, he's talking primarily about dogs. So if you're a cat owner, cat lover, you might see the cats are a little bit different in that respect. And that's actually an interesting question about pets and pet cloning, the way that dogs are emblematic of this kind of love and excess. So pet cloning seems like a violation to me of both that distance or otherness and that sort of intimate sameness. And I can say more about that, but that's kind of where I would like to think about this. It's a violation of both of those things. In other ways, it seems to reduce the pet to the bare minimum of its genetic makeup. And it's like de-extinction in this way and other kinds of genetic technologies. There are certain parallels to de-extinction in the denial of relationality that occurs in pet cloning. That is, the idea that life is constituted by and in relationships, and a denial of death itself, or death writ large in the case of extinction. In the same way that de-extinction is promoted by some as an alternative to grief, that we don't need to mourn over these losses. We can just bring these things back, and that's sort of a good news story. In the same way, some pet cloners present their technology as a solution to grief, as one puts it, an alternative to a funeral. So there's something that disrupts the process of grieving, which has, grieving has great moral import. It's an important process. So in my recent foray into the strange world of pet cloning led me to other death practices. These include pet taxidermy, and a newer approach that's apparently becoming somewhat popular, freeze drying your dead pet. The fact that freeze drying, and talk about the yuck factor, which we'll talk about more in a moment, the fact that freeze drying seems appropriate to some pet owners, but presumably no one would sanction this practice for a deceased child or a friend or a family member, suggests a kind of defect in how we think about pets and the human-pet relationship. Some line has been sort of redrawn, reasserted to keep pets apart from humans, despite the fact that they've come to be seen as family members. So I think there's a certain similarity actually between pet cloning and things like taxidermy or, freeze drying, in that they capture the likeness of something in ways that seem to transcend death, and yet do not deliver the entity that was lost. Both the preserved or stuffed pet and the clone are sort of simulacra. The problem is that our impulses, our sort of affective stance toward the simulacrum is based on our experience with the original. So the affect that's geared towards that simulated creature, I think, does a disservice to the memory of the pet and the uniqueness of that relationship. And so there's something about pets that sort of switches back and forth between subject and object, even a kind of art object, I think, in some cases. And it's that sort of moving back and forth between subject and object that makes our treatment of them, and I would say, especially in the case of pet cloning, incoherent. So I'll just stop there. And so those are just some of the things that have struck me, and sort of the way that I'm inclined to think about this issue.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a fascinating introduction to such a touching topic. You mentioned earlier personal experiences. As you might know, I went through something similar, and it appears that for many of us, people of more, let's call them developed societies from a certain viewpoint, suffering and death when it comes to our smaller, humbler sisters and brothers, our pets, isn't something that we are prepared for. Hence, so many other reactions, apart from grief. People want to resurrect their pets with all the implications that you have just pointed out. Now, let's see if we can access your slides, and then Margot and Lisa, you'll have your say.
Thank you, Lisa. And I saw an abstract of a paper you're going to write on this, and I picked out what I thought were the most important points in the paper. And so what I've done in the following slides is I quote you, some of which you've just highlighted as being important points for you too, and then ask questions about it. So one of the things that you emphasized was the uniqueness of a pet and its singularity, including the singularity of the relationship that we have with a pet. As a matter of fact, I'm sitting at a table that's got a cushion right down the far end, and on top of it is my Bengal cat called Charlie Brown. And I'm amazed by her intelligence. I mean, she genuinely talks to me. Now, if I had a clone of Charlie Brown, I'm sure that that clone wouldn't be able to talk to me in the way that Charlie does. And this idea of singularity and uniqueness is something that I've been involved with in many contexts, actually. And I've sort of mused about it, because why for example, there's a big case going on in Australia at the moment about one of Australia's most lauded painters. And somebody has copied his work and sold it as his original. And they're huge paintings, and they're very expensive, up to $5 million. And there's been an expose of this by a series of television programs on our ABC, Australian Broadcasting Commission. And I'm puzzled, why would one canvas with an almost identical painting on it, the same colors, the same scenes, everything, be worth $5 million? And what they estimated the copy was worth was $200. Mm-hmm. And so what is it about that original artwork compared with copies? What are we paying for with that extra 4.8 million or more, 4.9 something million? And similarly, what about antiques? That when you make an identical chest of drawers, why is the original one that belonged, let's say, to the King of England so valuable, but the copy isn't anywhere near the value? And then I thought about human beings, because we also are talking about human beings and cloning them. And as a matter of fact, you mentioned George Church from Harvard. And I got into a massive discussion and conflict with him and some of the Thomas, is it Pinker? What, I can't remember his first name. Is it Stephen or Thomas?
He does definitely associate with Steven Pinker. Yeah.
Yeah, and they were all arguing for the use of cloning or CRISPR to design new children, CRISPR-Cas19, and I stood up and said, no, you can't do that. It's not ethical. And then, of course, you've got to think about, why isn't that ethical? And of course, the argument against it is we're only trying to do good. We're trying to do good outcomes from this. So it's a very difficult issue. So, and that idea that you've got there, even that pets choose us. I have a colleague who was looking for a new cat, and she said, "Oh, I love this kitten," but she said, "I couldn't take it because it didn't choose me." So people do want to be chosen by the pet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that this idea about, you know, the original versus the copy, it's something that, you know, environmental ethicists have thought a lot about too. Like, you know, there was a classic paper years ago called Faking Nature, you know, which is about even when a place is restored, you know, an ecosystem or a forest or something like that, it's, you know, not quite the same thing. Like, even if it looks the same, even if you couldn't tell by looking at it, there's a kind of value that's been lost. And, you know, trying to sort of get at what that value is that's been lost, that can't be replicated, is a really tricky thing, I think, across all of these cases. You know, I mean, I think with the painter and the original work of art, it's something about, you know, that it flows from the genius, the creative genius of that particular individual. And I think that's similar to what some of these theologians are saying about animals too, that there's a kind of, it's, you know, their value comes from their creation in God, which is the ultimate source of value. That's what Andrew Linzey is saying with a kind of theocentric account of animal rights. So, you know, but there are always sort of counterexamples to these things too, that makes it, if you don't know the difference when you look at the ecosystem, for example, or the forest or whatever, then what does it matter, you know? But
well, yeah,
go ahead.
There's an example. I don't know if you remember this, but the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games, they had a little Chinese girl who was absolutely beautiful. She was adorable. And they had another little girl who had actually sung the opening song, and she had a beautiful voice, but she wasn't pretty. So what they did, they used the pretty little girl and used the voice of the other little girl, but they didn't tell anybody. And then there was outrage. So, I mean, it's also got to do with, I think, a search for perfectionism. And what is, I think, paradoxical is that it's almost becoming now that sort of difference and blemishes are more desirable than the perfect, because the perfect can be just replicated.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, once you start being able to kind of create life in this way, why not, you know, why stop at just creating it? Why not perfect it at the same time? And, you know, that just becomes a matter of tweaking something. So it changes how we think about life, and it changes how we think about the beauty of imperfection as well.
By the way, George Church's I just can't remember his name, the guy who's the psychologist that works with George Church. Anyway, he wrote an editorial in the New York Times saying that if bioethicists want to stop this, then what we should do is get rid of the bioethicists, not stop doing.
Yeah, well, he's also talked about cloning Neanderthals. So, you know, I mean, de-extincting them, that is, you know, if we get the DNA, we can de-extinct them. So if there's an adventurous female that can be implanted with a surrogate, those are his very words, an adventurous female. So,
the person I'm thinking of is Steven Pinker.
Yeah.
Okay, so here was another one of the things that you said.
I didn't talk about this in my introduction, but yeah.
Yeah, part of childhood experience. I think that's very interesting and important. And what it brought to mind for me was the connection between cruelty to animals and criminality. That we know that people who are cruel to animals are often cruel to humans too, and often criminal offenses.
And so hopefully people that are compassionate and can appreciate the loss of a pet then become more passionate adults. So this thing about the first death, of, you know, a pet being kind of a child's first experience. For many of us, our first encounter with death is through a pet. You know, that's an interesting thing, because there's so much lack of uniformity. Part of the problem with pet death is that there aren't, one person called it like a disenfranchised kind of grief. You know, we don't have, people have developed rituals, but there aren't like standard rituals for grieving an animal. Like, do you bury them? Do they have a gravestone? You know, do you have an actual ritual of some sort? And, you know, it's partly, I think it's kind of like climate change grief, you know, and other kinds of environmental grief and mourning, that we don't really have standard or widely recognized ways of grieving these things. And so people, sometimes I think that the grief response gets like perverse in some way, you know, that it comes out in ways that are not healthy, or it's not like fully processed. And so I thought this is a very interesting thing, that you know, how useful in a sense people's experiences with losing a pet can be in helping them sort of figure out what death means and how to properly grieve it.
We have an organization here in Australia called Grief Link, and the chair of it is a friend of mine. And when I was looking at this, I said to her, you know, you've really got to think about children. And because of what you wrote, I said this, and the fact that their grief and adults' grief too about pets. I said, you should put in a section on pets. And she said, have a look at it. There is a section. So they've put a section in. And also I heard that Roald Dahl had written a book for children about losing a pet. So I think there's more attention to that now. Here's your third point that I thought was really important: the irreplaceability of a unique living organism. And you paralleled it with de-extinction as an avoidance of grieving and a denial of loss. I think that's really interesting. How do you feel about de-extinction?
I feel very very irked about it, actually. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like, well, there are certain ways that de-extinction technologies can be useful in conservation, you know, and also storing the genetic, you know, material from organisms that are on the brink of extinction. But, you know, the way in which at least some of the most kind of outspoken proponents of de-extinction present it is really, it's completely divorced from its ecological context. It's something more like just the idea of bringing back this novelty and how exciting that would be. Wouldn't it be exciting to see like a woolly mammoth? So they sort of come up with these elaborate kind of ad hoc, you know, ecological justifications, when the interest really, I think, is much more in just the excitement of, wouldn't it be cool if we could bring this thing back? And I'm not saying that, I mean, I think that you know, people who clone pets, people who've lost a pet are genuinely often, you know, quite distraught about that. But I think they're misunderstanding something about, you know, what it is that makes a creature what it is, which is this, you know, the influence of relationships and environment, and again, the sort of, you know, the irreplaceability of that particular individual organism. So I see a kind of similar lack of understanding of what makes something sort of what it is, and the sort of reduction to the idea that if somehow you can just, you know, if you can just bring the genetic, you know, the genome back, you've got the thing. And so you mentioned, I think, something about, you said something about, I think, about epigenetics in one of the slides that you had. So
the next one, I think, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But what's the point about robots that you were going to make? Because that, I thought that was interesting, but I'm not sure where that is. It the robot is sort of not really like a creature because it doesn't have that sort of relational quality. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, I don't know if you see some of these documentaries on sex robots, and then, you know, in the one I saw, the man became incredibly attached to it and took it everywhere and had it, with him when he went on vacation, and
Yeah.
treated it like a living human partner. And so it occurred to me to think about that. And also, there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment with artificial intelligence about whether you can program a robot to be ethical. And
there are also robo pets. I mean, in Japan, people have these robo pets, and they're quite attached to them. And when like they're, they fall apart, when they don't work anymore, they take them to these special, they're sort of like shrines where they put like a new parts back in, and they have a whole ritual surrounding it.
Well, that's like cloning, isn't
Amazing.
it? You clone your robot.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, will they displace humans? I read a story of an entrepreneur who started a new factory, and the goal was to have not a single human working in that business. It would be all artificial intelligence. So, I mean, that's the other thing. Are we going to get cloned out of existence by robots?
I hadn't really thought about the connection, especially to robo pets. That's sort of interesting. Because again, I feel like in the same way that the freeze dried or taxidermied pet is sort of supposed to be the same thing, there's something about this kind of deadness of these organisms, where they're sort of frozen in this moment in some way. But I guess the robo pets are pretty authentic. I mean, they're pretty convincing as pets. People become, and they feel that they have sort of individual, kind of personalities.
Okay, here's the epigenetics one. Now, the focus on genetic identity rather than relationality, and how creatures are the product not just of genes, but also relational context. This is a really important issue in the use of genetic technology, as I'm sure you're aware. And epigenetics, for the people who are not familiar with that, is gene-environment interaction. And a colleague of mine at McGill, Professor Michael Meany, was one of the discoverers of this phenomenon, that we can be born with genes which are inactive until we have a certain outside experience. And those genes have got a time limit placed on them. If you don't have the experience within that time, then those genes shut down and it can't be resurrected. And the experiment that Michael and his colleagues did was baby rats that were taken away from their mother at birth, and the mother couldn't lick them, then became inadequate parents. They couldn't nurture their own baby rats because the gene for nurturing behavior had not been activated.
This is like the intergenerational trauma stuff.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And that can be inherited to the intergenerational trauma. So this is a big thing. This genes are us instead of nature and nurture.
And another, link back to the de-extinctionists and George Church in particular, one of the things that he's proposed, so the way they would do this with the mammoth is to put the, it's actually gene edited as well. So it's like a mixture of elephant DNA and mammoth DNA. They're trying to sort of, tweak it to get it as close to a mammoth as they can. And then the surrogate would be an Asian elephant, but Asian elephants are endangered. So they've decided that they can make an artificial womb. So you can imagine something, elephants and mammoths have like a 2-year gestational period. So it's a very long gestation. And, a machine that could gestate this thing for 2 years. I mean, again, it's a denial of the, of the uterine environment as playing any role in the way that something develops. Because, certain hormones trigger certain developmental events, and as things gestate. I mean, it's similar to what you're talking about, that the idea that you've just got the genes, that's all that matters. It doesn't, the context in which a fetus is developing, the fact that it's in a machine rather than in a living body doesn't make any difference to them at all. That's just negligible as far as they're concerned.
They're getting very advanced with artificial uteruses though now, and it's a worry. Probably one of my statements that relates to this, that in a speech I gave at a conference, was that I wondered whether being religious was an epigenetic phenomenon, and that we had to have a gene for religious perception, and that had to be activated at a very young age, or otherwise it's shut down for life. And I had everybody, outraged, both the religious people and the non-religious ones. The non-religious ones didn't want to have the gene. And then some of the religious people said, oh, I got brought up in a family where there was no religion, and I became religious when I was 19 years old. And do you mean to say I haven't got the same experience? Anyway, I got myself into a lot of trouble with it. But it's an interesting thought, though, whether it is, there could be a genetic base, which doesn't mean that it's only genetic. It means I equated it to being like having a television or a radio, and that if you didn't have the television set or the radio, you couldn't watch the program or hear it. But it didn't mean the program didn't exist. It was all
right. Right.
Yeah.
You're just picking something up that other people don't pick up. Yeah.
So, and this is the last one from your slides, Lisa, about the slippery slope to human cloning. And
yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noticed when I was trying to find anything I could about, especially any kind of religious response to pet cloning, which is very hard to find, but there are a few ethical concerns raised. But almost everyone in a religious context, they immediately just move to the concern about, it leading to human cloning without thinking at all about the sort of ethical issues for the animals themselves. So I thought that was interesting, because I mean, it's disappointing, I think, that people aren't thinking about it aside from that. I mean, that is a legitimate concern, but it's certainly not the only one.
It also made me wonder, though, what do you think about this for agriculture?
Yeah, I mean,
not for a pet, but because I think they are doing it, aren't they? In agriculture.
I think, though, I think what people like Stephen Webb are saying is that part of what, he's not addressing cloning specifically, but that part of what makes the human pet relationship special is this kind of mutuality, and I don't think he's like overly romantic about this, but there's something that happens in the relationship of a human and a pet, or I guess a dog. So maybe your cat doesn't fit into this, neither do mine, but that there's not that it's necessarily like symmetric in every way or something, but that there's a kind of bond that comes from both parties. And there's something I think about the idea of cloning that really denies the reality of the bond that's coming from that other creature, that is a sort of volitional thing that creature is doing that can't simply be recreated.
Well,
so with plants or things, I suppose, a lot of these same issues wouldn't apply, although, back to the de-extinction case, I think that, like there's examples of people now looking to de-extinct the American chestnut tree, which is functionally extinct in America after these blights that killed it. And, that was a really iconic tree in America. It was really beautiful. And it was, very abundant, great source of food. It was a keystone species. And I think, maybe it's okay to bring that one back. And I always sort of wonder why do I think that's okay? But I don't think it's okay.
Well, they had a ceremony here in Sydney, Sydney University, when it was founded, and I think it's like a couple of 100 years ago, well, probably a bit less than that, maybe 170 years. They planted a jacaranda tree, and in the
we have those here.
Yeah, and then the jacaranda tree died a natural death not so long ago, and they had taken pieces from it and they'd cloned baby jacarandas, and they had them growing up to a certain level, and they had an event to plant the replacement jacaranda tree. So, it's a funny business about what are we doing? Are we pretending in some way that we're immortal? I mean,
yeah.
No,
I think the de-extinction stuff is definitely really ultimately about human immortality, and not just as a sort of slippery slope kind of thing that they're just trying it on animals first. I think it's really about kind of having that biopower, that kind of control over life and death in ways that obviously makes them quite giddy with power, the way that some of them write about it. There's there's a reason that George Church calls his book Regenesis, or that these words like Genesis come up all the time. Yeah.
When Dolly's birth was announced, Dolly the clone mammal sheep, I happened to be at Oxford, and I was talking to Alan Troughton, who's a very famous cell biologist here. And I've never forgotten what he said. He said, Margot, what we can do in animals now, we will do in humans in 7 years' time. And, that's largely proven to be accurate. Oh, yeah, I put that there, what we were doing. So, and the other thing I thought about that was that increased familiarity weakens our ethical intuitions against cloning, and humanization occurs quickly.
And this kind of normalization, I think, it's worrying in a lot of environmental contexts, where not only are we kind of adjusting to the idea that we can genetically, like assisted evolution, enhance, organisms to save them, and getting used to the idea that we're kind of directing evolution through these genetic technologies, but also the way that, what people call sort of environmental amnesia, that each new generation that's born, that the world that they're born into seems normal to them, because they don't know all the other things that have been lost. They don't see all of the degradation of the environment, and that kind of normalization is really, I think it is really worrying, because we lose that kind of place from which we can say that something of great value has been lost. We can't even see it anymore.
Yep. So the bioethics analysis, very quickly, is keeping pets unethical?
I ask myself this question a lot.
Peter Singer thinks it is.
I know he does. I know he thinks that. Yeah.
I've argued with him about it. I think Charlie Brown does okay.
Well, what concerns me the most, I think, because, we have all of these pets now who need homes. So, I mean, unless you're going to euthanize them all or something, there's not any practical way of, any practical or humane way of dealing with them. But one of the things that worries me, so I guess more in a way that I feel more complicit in, is pet food, So, if you have to feed, especially cats who are obligate carnivores, I know very little about what goes into the meat that's in those cans and that food. And I suspect it's not good, and it's also a huge carbon footprint, actually.
I have huge angst about it, because I feed Charlie human food and raw meat, but the one she likes best is kangaroo, and I've got real problems.
Well, there's lots of those around. So
yeah, I sort of, it's a bit of a cop-out, but I've adopted a principle that as long as a animal has a reasonable animal life and is killed without cruelty, I sort of justify using the meat, but I have problems with it. I don't know that I really believe the arguments I give myself. Yeah, not easy. is it inherently wrong? What do you think?
I mean, I guess I think it is inherently wrong, at least in the sense that, I mean, even if it could be done without suffering for surrogates and all of those animals that are involved, I think it's wrong in the sense that it just fundamentally violates the relationship that you had with a particular being.
So it's a backwards violation. It's a violation with the clone that you cloned. Yeah.
And I mean, it doesn't mean that a cloned animal wouldn't be loved, or, you know, and it might well turn out not to be like the one that you had before. That is the case. People who have cloned their animals. So Barbara Streisand is the famous case that she had her dog cloned. And so she got two of them because they had extras. And, you know, neither one of them is very much like the one that she loved so much. But, you know, you can also learn to love an animal that's different. It's not that those animals aren't worth anything, but I think the act of trying to recreate something that you loved that much that you feel like you can't live without it, you know, the thing to do is to sit with that sadness, you know, and that sort of love, because that's what it's telling you, right? It's telling you that this is a unique loss that can't be replaced.
Yeah.
But the yuck factor thing is interesting as well, you know, and I do think, especially the idea of, I mean, the freeze drying of pets. There were some images of this that I saw, and I just can't believe there are people who think that that's appropriate.
Yeah.
And then sitting around their house.
Yeah. This comes back to the genes are us. I mean, even identical twins are not the same. And
right.
And
they're often quite different, in fact.
Yeah. Okay. So is it wrong on a utilitarian basis? I think you make a very strong argument that it is.
It is clearly wrong on that basis, I think.
Yeah. And this is what occurred to me. Who are the reference subjects for risk, harm, benefit analysis? The animals or the owners? I mean, if you did it on the basis of the owners, they might say this has got much more benefit than harm for me, but it's got much more harm than benefit for the animal. So you see a conflict between the benefits there, which I think is interesting. And we usually err on the side of the human, and also the animal hardly can tell you, I don't want to be cloned, can it?
Right, exactly.
And is it unethical to clone? If it's unethical to clone a human, which I think it is, can it be ethical to clone an animal? And this comes out, you know, with the bioethics theory that is under a lot of attack. Again, Peter Singer is a leader in this, about humans are just another animal. They're not exceptional. And so what we don't do to animals, we shouldn't do to humans, etc. Like the other way around. And he argues with speciesism, that is a form of wrongful discrimination.
But, you know, I think that a pet is sort of a different category here. And if he doesn't recognize that category as being valuable, then I don't think you know, can convince him of that. But, you know, it's true that we kill and eat, some of us, you know, don't kill ourselves, but we, you know, animals are killed and we eat them. Many people engage in that. People have pets. And, you know, I do think there are problems that we need to sort out about that. Most people just try not to think about it. But I also think that the pet is a unique category, that it's in the way that I think that Stephen Webb talks about it is quite interesting, you know, that it brings something out in us that is a good thing, and that doesn't make it a completely utilitarian way of valuing them. But you know, the pets can make us better people. And we're, you know, our main obligations, he wants to argue, are really to those animals that we have, you know, domesticated and brought into our lives. We have our first line of duty is to them, you know, and you know, not to animals in the wild, and not that we don't have any, but our first duties are to those that we have these interdependent relationships with, that we brought, you know, into relationship with ourselves.
This argument was particularly prominent in the euthanasia debate. That the pro-euthanasia people said, well, you know, you're merciful, kind, and you don't let your pet suffer. You give it a lethal injection, and you should do the same for your mother because you love your mother. And but you know, when Peter's mother was she was very old, she was in her 90s, and she had dementia, and Newsweek asked him would he have euthanasia for his mother, and he said no, and they were very surprised and said, why not? He said, oh, it's different when it's your mother.
Right. No, I remember reading that article where he says that. Right. It's different when it's your mother.
Yeah. I mean, I admire Peter enormously. I don't agree with him about almost anything. I spent 6 months at the center at Monash, where he was the head of it, and we didn't agree, but we were good friends. And I think that's important. But
no, I think that he did some really valuable work in moving people to think about speciesism. Yeah.
And he's a person who practices what he preaches.
Yeah, he does.
In that regard. Okay, so why is it inherently wrong or unethical? And here
I think that's right.
Hans Jonas is right. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. We've got a right to come from untampered with natural human origins.
I mean, it's tricky because we've made pets. I mean, that's one of the, people would say that pets are a human creation to a large extent. And that, but the fact that we have reshaped them in all these ways doesn't mean that we have complete control to recreate life. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I rather like the idea that we're co-creators with whether you call it God or the great unknown or whatever term you want to use, but that doesn't give us ultimate freedom to do anything. That the role of bioethics, life ethics, is particularly the most important question is what should we not do with this amazing new technology that we've got? And what would it mean? I mean, in the context of cloning pets, what would that mean if we transferred some of the same thoughts and arguments and emotions to humans? Does it put humans in danger?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and this is Jürgen Habermas talking, which doesn't really apply to animals at all.
A right not to be designed.
Yeah. Well, then maybe animals have got a right not to be designed.
Well, one of the things that it's Stephen Webb who says this, that it was much easier, that dogs have been much more manipulated than cats, that the form of the cat doesn't change that much, but the form of a dog is almost endlessly malleable. And that's interesting, sort of, to think about the way that we relate to them too, and the way all the different types of dogs we've created. Whereas cats are more or less just cats still, like they're different types, but they don't vary as much. And cats are also much harder to clone than dogs. And so I think all of these things are relevant to the human-dog relationship as being the sort of paradigm for some reason.
It's also interesting, Lisa, to think about what kind of people relate to cats and what kind of people relate to dogs. Or
I know it's on God and dogs. It's not on God and cats. There's no book called On God and Cats.
Yeah. Cats have actually got, of all creatures, cats have got the most uniform genome from the tiniest ones to the biggest ones. Their differences are mainly in size. I think that's amazing. Yeah. Okay, so there's only a couple more. And so, this is democracy. First of all, Habermas said it was inherently wrong to design a child, but later on, and this was really what George Church and Stephen were on about, well, what about if you could eliminate, for example, Huntington's chorea, a horrible genetic mental disease that comes on people's 30s. And therefore they made a distinction between therapeutic use and enhancement use. I don't know whether that applies to animals or not. And I thought they didn't apply. And I'm also interested in what you think about this. I make a distinction between repairing nature when it fails compared with doing the impossible in nature. And a lot of bioethicists don't agree with me about that. They don't think nature has got any relevance at all.
So what do you mean when it fails? What does that mean exactly?
Well, for example, you've got a ruptured appendix. That's nature killing you and failing. And so would you be justified at using technology, which you do in surgery, to take out the person's appendix? It's a very simple example. And I mean, I think there would be some difficult questions about whether you're in a situation of nature failing or a situation of enhancing nature, particularly if you're messing around with the human genome. But where this has become very relevant is mitochondrial disease, which, children who are born with that, they die often within 4 years. And they can now replace the defective mitochondrial DNA, although there's lots of problems with it as well. It's not 100% sure and effective. But could you say that's repairing nature, and not designing a new human? And doing the impossible in nature is to design. Well, it's not easy. It's not an easy distinction.
Yeah, no, I mean, even the therapy enhancement line is pretty difficult to draw.
Yeah. So,
But I think there's a lot of things we don't know about, like organs that seem to be dangerous or useless. Like there are things maybe that, if we were to, eliminate them entirely and say that,
They're saying nothing about using organs from animals that have been genetically modified to be acceptable to a human.
Yeah, and that's the guy who does this cloning in South Korea. I mean, that's part of, he's also, and George Church, other people involved in cloning, genetically engineering animals specifically for use as organs, and especially pigs, of course. That's the most common one. So, yeah.
Okay. And then this is just we've really brought up all these topics, and I think we've got to go deeper and say, what is an animal? Is it a special category of life? It's not a thing, it's a being for sure, and we're all beings, but then is it a person? Is it absolutely equivalent to us? And I think there's a lot that we need to think about there. And I think another question I'd suggest is, do animals have an inherent dignity that must be respected? And is that the reason that cruelty to them is wrong? I mean, I'm a fanatic against animal cruelty. I think it's absolutely appalling. And I like this saying of Pope Francis, like us, they're God's creatures too. I think that's a wonderful saying.
Yeah.
And we can look into intention and why we do it and for whom we do it, and ask, is that...
Yeah, I think the intentions matter a lot with all of these technologies. But I mean, I think your example here about saving a child from grief is an interesting one. Or a therapeutic, like a therapy dog, like cloning a therapy dog, which I think they're already doing it for that reason, because some dogs are so good at doing that. Right.
Well, I got Charlie, I brought my other cat, a Siamese called Didgeridoo, out from Canada on a companion animal ticket in order to be able to get her into Australia. So, I'm pretty sympathetic to that. And would it be ethical to make a clone of a pet in order to use the clone to provide organs for the pet? And that's Kazuo Ishiguro, where he writes a book about how very wealthy people had themselves cloned, and the clones were all kept in an institution. And it was so, and they made a film out of it, and it showed this beautiful young 24-year-old man, and they took his heart for the old man whose clone he was, and they just went, after they got the heart, they didn't worry about the man whose heart it was. And they just left him on the operating table bleeding. I mean, it was just shocking. And I thought, what about if you did that for an animal? So this is what's a conclusion I came to. There's more we can do with the new science than we should do from an ethical perspective. And I think the big things are the big question is, what should we not do? And I call the old virtue of prudence wise ethical restraint, because my medical students like wise ethical restraint and they hate prudence.
Yeah, well, just, you know, restraining ourselves is the hardest task, really.
Yeah. And then I've become more and more enamored of moral humility, that we recognize that we're all morally fallible, that we listen open-mindedly to the people who disagree with us, and that we see just beyond our own interests to the common good and to feeling part of a much larger whole. And then that we need moral courage when we conclude that what we ought to do bioethically is something that will hurt us or our loved ones, especially our children. I know of people who've come to me and said, I agree with you about some of the things I say, but I would never say it publicly because I know that my children would be bullied at school if their father said that. So I think we've got an awful lot to do, Lisa.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, the big problem too is that even if people can restrain themselves, it's just the lack of regulation. I mean, things happen before there's any sort of oversight of them, and this is just happening more and more. So there's a lot of areas where things are completely unregulated right now. De-extinction is one of them, geoengineering, gene drives, all kinds of stuff that's happening that no one, you know, it's just up to scientists to self-regulate. And, you know, they're not really known for being great at self-regulating.
Yeah, I often think of Oppenheimer and the nuclear bomb.
Exactly. Exactly.
So much to think about. So I'm very grateful for your input, both of you, Lisa and Margot. And I'd like to begin this last part of our seminar by asking a question, and feel free, either of you, to respond, or both of you, about uniqueness and exceptionalism. I find it fascinating that both of you refer to pets, and I assume, through generalization, animals as unique beings. And I know there's a push in certain parts of the world for acknowledging the personality of, well, let's say, ecosystems. Why not individual animals, and why not our pets? That's, I think, a very new, at least to me, a very new development. And personally, I salute it, because remembering stuff I did in my childhood when I thought animals were things, I'm not very proud of it. I think I would have needed a kind of different catechism, so to speak, where respect for the uniqueness of animals would have been well, forefront. Anyway, so can you comment further on this? Because perhaps in some milieus, let's call them Christian milieus, yeah, animals are considered persons. Their uniqueness is contested on the grounds of us human beings being literally created in God's image, and therefore having an exceptional status within the creation. How can we communicate this message without bypassing the scriptural narrative on humankind made in God's image to these milieus, Christian milieus, that are reluctant to consider animals, including our pets, but if not persons, at least unique? tell me my way of rolling the ball.
I think, Doru, that there's a difference between animals being unique and humans being exceptional. Exceptional means that we're not exactly we're also unique, but you can have a whole lot of unique creatures, which we all are. But to say that humans are exceptional, that doctrine in bioethics is in order to justify treating humans differently from animals. And the opposite is true. And this is what, people, for example, Peter Singer argue that we're not exceptional, and that means that we should all be treated the same. So if we don't eat animals, if we don't eat humans, we shouldn't eat animals. If we euthanize animals because we're being compassionate, we should euthanize humans when we need to be compassionate. So that's what the doctrines are.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't work. I mean, that is what I can't abide sort of in Singer's arguments, even though I think he's done, he's pushed the argument about the worth of animals along in ways that are really important. But, humans and animals and all different kinds of creatures, they're valuable in all these different ways, and I think that's part of what, even what Webb is saying a little bit about pets is that not only that different animals are valuable in different ways, but part of what is valuable is the particular relationship. What's unique is the particular relationship that forms between my cat and me. If my cat had been raised by someone else, so to speak, she would have been a different kind of cat in certain ways. We brought different things out in each other. So I think part of what he's saying is unique is the relationship between two individuals that can't be reproduced. And I think there's something, I don't know like how that will work, if it does work in a Christian context, but I think it works in other religious contexts. Like I think it works in maybe certain indigenous contexts of thinking about what it is to be a person. Like we can all be persons and still be very different, and animals can be persons, but personhood is a thing that comes into existence in a relationship. I'm not a person apart from my relationships. And actually Pope Francis speaks in this way as well. When he talks about the term person, he says means inclusion, not exclusion, and he was sort of pushing back against sort of, excessive individualism. So a person is a thing that comes into being in a relationship. It doesn't make sense apart from that. And I think that something like that is what's going on in the human pet relationship that's unique to those individuals coming together. So I don't know, Doru, is there a way that can sort of fit?
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, Margot, please go on, and then I'll add something.
Yeah, I mean, what you're arguing there is that what criterial view of personhood, that you've got to be able to do something in order to be a person. And one thing it seems to me you're choosing you've got to be able to do is to enter into a relationship. And again, that would be Peter Singer's view.
Right.
And the danger in that is that if you are, for example, you're intellectually challenged or you're permanently unconscious, it means you're not a person. And if being, for example, if you only have a right to life, if you're a person, then you've got a big problem there, because that means those people do not have a right to life.
Right. So I think I'm thinking about the concept of personhood as we're talking about here as something that comes into being in relationships. That might set up very different kinds of ethics towards something like euthanasia, for example, versus like cloning. I don't know. I'm just thinking in the context of something like pet cloning. Seems to me that the reason that it's wrong is because it denies the specialness of that particular relationship between, two beings. But you're right that like this idea of personhood as being like a defining characteristic of what makes someone a person is their ability to relate, then that does create a lot of dangerous, implications for how to treat, beings that are no longer persons or that are pre-personal or post-personal or whatever. But I think that's maybe slightly different from talking about what's unique about a relationship is that it's something created between two people, and that it should be honored when one of those entities dies. The way to honor it is not to try to recreate it by bringing back another organism that's going to replace it, but to dwell with that loss of something that is not going to ever return in that particular form.
Yeah.
My question actually has a, let's call it a background. Perhaps some of you know my work is mainly in the patristic tradition, so I deal with early Christian texts and stuff like that. And what I found there in my, well, almost 30 years of research in that literature is a wide variety of opinions, including in terms of what we would call today the person. And perhaps for us, to ask questions about what's a person sounds outrageous because it, as Margot pointed out, it can have strange implications. We have seen the 20th century, well, or even this last week, we see people killing each other because they don't recognize themselves as or each other as persons. I assume to an extent it's just a matter of taking revenge and stuff like that. Persons don't mean in that case. But that's not what I'm thinking of. What I'm thinking of is actually the idea of degrees of, well, let's use an Aristotelian term, actualizing personhood. So there's this sense that I found across the spectrum of early Christian literature that there are degrees of actualizing the fact of being persons. True, these early Christian authors did not apply this kind of logic to the animal kingdom, but they did so in regard to humanity. And I think this is very interesting, especially given that in some corners of the same literature, there is room for a sense of the entire creation, not only the human creation, the entire creation from mineral, because they didn't know of lower levels, from mineral to plant life, to animal life, to human life, to angelic life. That was the cosmos for them, including in the invisible. All these were imprinted with the mark of the creation, or the creator, sorry, to the extent that what we speak in terms of human, well, in human terms as being made in God's image, a kind of divine imprint, a kind of divine image is present in all things. And from this viewpoint, we can speak of a, well, tendency towards actualizing, let's use the words personhood, in corners of the creation that we don't recognize as human. Well, that's my backdrop. But perhaps this is not quite right for me to monopolize the conversation. And so let's see what our audience has to say.
Daru, can I just comment on that? That I think the only safe definition of person is human being means person, but that doesn't mean that you can't have other entities that you also make persons. And indeed, that's happening a lot at the moment. For example, the Arctic has been declared a person with the same legal rights as a human person. The same thing about the Colorado River. And we've got all sorts of examples. And in the law, for a very long time, ships and aeroplanes had legal status. They could sue. And so, you could be, I think we've got to be careful about saying we can define which human beings are persons and which are not, because women were not persons until the 1930s. Slaves were not persons. Very dangerous, very dangerous.
Cool.
In the history of pet keeping, to bring it back to pets for a minute, I mean, it's a lot of historians. There are some historians of pet keeping. Keith Thomas, when he writes about pets, he says that what seems to have happened in terms of turning people outward towards seeing intelligence and sentience and all kinds of remarkable characteristics in organisms in the natural world actually came first from the experience of having pets. It was when people recognized the intelligence and affection and all the wonderful things in animals that they got to know, they began to see those things in other animals in the natural world.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa and Margot, for your presentations. I've never owned a pet, but I've had to look after someone else's cat for long periods of time and to put it to bed at night and all that kind of thing. And so I do have some sense of what you both are saying in terms of, shall we say, the existential quality of a relationship between a human being and a cat in terms of care and closeness and so on. It seems to me Lisa's argument is dare I say, virtually a Kantian one, in the sense of treating a being never as a means to an end, but also always as an end in itself. So the relationship with the pet can't be just a means to an end, but an end in itself.
Yeah.
It has a kind of existential quality, maybe we can't say moral quality, but an existential quality. And that seems to me a good argument, and not an argument that maybe would apply in animal breeding, livestock breeding. That's a whole issue. And also one could raise the question, well, if it's a budgerigar rather than a cat or a dog, will that argument apply? So I think you've certainly convinced me that there's an existential argument about the nature of a relationship against cloning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways it's distinctly not Kantian, in the sense that Kant himself, his argument about animals was that, that animals themselves could only have at best indirect, rights, that our duties to animals were not to the animal itself, but to the person who owns the animal. So if I kill your dog, I owe you rather than the dog some sort of, restitution or something. But yeah, I mean, I think that animals, I think all our relationships have instrumental aspects to them. We get things from people that we need, but if you think of a pet only in those terms, which I think cloning is a way of just sort of, of just seeing the, what I can get back, what will make me feel better if I can bring back this pet that feels enough like the thing that was gone. It's too much about our own ends and not about the animal and the worth of the animal.
And as you noted in the case of the cloned dogs, it's foolishness in any event, because the cloned dog will have different feelings, different responses, and so on.
Right.
Okay, Neil and then Lynn.
Yeah, thanks, Dora, and thanks to Margot and Lisa. One of the things I thought would be raised, but hasn't been raised, is just about the proportionate or disproportionate use of resources. That this is an extremely, in terms of the you mentioned, Lisa, at the beginning of your talk, all that had to be involved in terms of other animals, and medical procedures, and that this is enormously expensive. And the outcome,
it's getting a little cheaper, but it's still.
But it's disproportionate to the outcome, which is, you pointed out with Barbara, or someone, you or Margaret pointed out with Barbara Streisand.
Yeah.
You get these two claims, they're not the same anyway. You might as well go down to the local pet shop and buy yourself something at a fraction of the cost, and you've got a replacement. So there's something there's something to me that's there about the fetishization of pets
Yeah.
that we engage in, and it's not just in cloning. It's people spend amazing amounts of money on their pets for silly things like diamond bracelets and all this sort of stuff. And you think there's something inherently immoral about the way in which that relationship to the animal is disproportionate.
Yeah.
To the actual good involved.
And also people are like flying to South Korea to meet their, but it's not just wealthy people. There are people, I was reading about people who mortgaged their homes and sold their cars to get the money to pay for this pet. And they do have, most of them are wealthy people, but some of them just sort of give up everything that they have to get this pet back. And they also have very interesting, their own kind of metaphysical beliefs that don't fit neatly into like a Christian or some other recognizable framework. This is just one example of this person who cloned his dog, and he recognizes that the dog isn't going to be exactly the same. He understands that. I don't know if they actually tell them that, and explain that to them, but some people seem to understand it. And he says, it's possible that the souls of his old dogs will enter the bodies of his new ones. He says, the spiritual part of me hopes that maybe the souls of Wolfie and Bubble, his two dogs, will go right back in. He says, spiritually, we don't know anything about our universe. How do we know that when these dogs are born, the souls of Wolfie and Bubble won't go back in there? They probably could. They probably would. They probably will.
But this also, the other side of this was pointed out, the difference between plant cloning and animal cloning. There is something clearly different. There is something like, I have no qualms at all about cloning a plant. It's done all the time, whether it's in agriculture or just, cutting a stem off something and planting it. The cloning of plants doesn't seem to have any of the implications that you're involved here. And it's something about the responsiveness of animals and dogs, because they're pack animals much more than cats, which are generally solitary animals.
They're more like us.
Yeah.
Dogs
we're pack animals too. We're herd animals in some sense. So there's a greater, higher degree of responsiveness and differentiation between the relationship one forms with a pet than with a tree.
Your comments make me think that maybe there's some element of hubris in that, you can create the new animal and it fulfills your desire. It's exactly what you want.
Well, someone once described capitalism as a bad materialization of Platonism. And that's basically, we're trying to reproduce perfect images of everything.
It goes back to what Margot was saying about perfection, I think.
Indeed.
The ideal type over and over again, just.
Cookie cutter perfection.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for that.
Thank you. Lynn, and then Peter.
I'm just going to say a series of things which are very interesting discussions sort of prompted for me, and I'm not going to face any, they're just going to be a series of observations. One is that was just the continuing sort of engineering belief by humans that we can solve all our issues through technological solutions. And essentially, we see it time and time again in climate. One of the areas I spend a lot of time thinking about, worrying about, I guess, is climate change and health. And the immense delay that we've seen in actually seeing people take climate change seriously, and the continuing sort of the continuing belief that there will be a technological solution, that we can draw down carbon, that we can do this, we can do that. Well, in fact, most likely we're not, and we're actually heading over the cliff very fast at the moment. But there continues to be this sort of the putting forward of the endless range of technological solutions, despite all the evidence that's actually in front of us. So that's one observation. I think the second observation obviously links into my kind of my value system, really. I mean, I'll speak. I mean, I'm a cat lover. I sit in the cat camp. And I've had cats, but I simply it's very interesting in your conversation, in your point that you made, Lisa, about that this perception that pets have a greater value than animals in the natural environment, and I found that very interesting, because we know that, for example, that things like animals inside octopuses are sentient beings, and that people form very strong relationships with animals that are not pets, and have very strong feelings, like First Nations people have very strong feelings about the animals that they're totems, and so there's this sense for me that kind of was a very sort of encapsulated our Western view of the things that hang around people in developed countries having more value than the way other people approach those things, and our persistent undervaluing of the environment and the costs, financial costs associated with the environment. The third thing was, of course, that, as you alluded to, with the cost of pet food, and where does pet food come from, but just the impact of discarded pets into the environment. I mean, in Australia, cats are responsible for millions of animals dying literally every night. Native animals dying each night, and so it's part of there's this, it's kind of like there's the overloved, and then there's the underloved, and essentially this complete focus on what must be an extremely small population of overloved animals, to a point which you actually have to say has some concerns really about people's insight and rationality. But then so that was that, and then my final point, and I promise you this is my final point, is the
all good points.
Thanks, Lisa, very much. You reassure. It was very sort of, you have to take a step speaking to a group of ethicist experts when you don't claim to have any cards in the space. But it is this thing about how First Nations people relate to country, and it was something that someone else said. I can't remember exactly who it was. And that was, we put a lot of effort into engaging our medical students with Aboriginal educators at the Australian Museum. And recently there was a fabulous exhibition about what's called the Barker, which is the Darling River in New South Wales, and the immense ecological decline that river system and many river systems in Australia have actually experienced. But there was this fantastic, as part of the exhibition, there was this fantastic interview with an elder. I can't remember where he came from, somewhere like Brewarrina, but where he actually described the Barker, the river, and as he was describing where it came from, its source, and how it flowed, and where it reached when it joined the Murray, and then it went out to the sea. He was actually referring to parts of his own body. And so he actually, so this is a man of the Barker, his clan, I can't remember the name of the clan, but has always lived around the Barker. He actually, he's a man of the Darling River. And it literally reflected in his body, and the health of the river and his health, therefore, is very inextricably linked. And so once again, it's just this sense of our very limited, our very limited sort of understanding of how people relate to country and how they relate to the natural environment, and essentially how far away this very, I think, spooky cloning of pet animals for is this, yeah, a tiny grain in the sand, but it's a very concerning grain. I stop talking now. I go on mute.
Well, I'll just say one thing about, I mean, I think you're right that there's a sort of disproportionate focus, all this affection that's geared towards pets when, you know, all these things, everything out of nature, things are going extinct and, you know, everything's falling apart. And I think, you know, what I would say, and I kind of wrote about this in my first book, is that it's not that like domestic animals or pets or something like that are more important. It's that I think we have different kinds of obligations to organisms that we're responsible for making them dependent on us essentially than we do to, you know, quote unquote wild animals. But you know, there's not really much left anymore that's wild in the way that it used to be. I mean, you know, Harriet Ritbo, who writes about a history of pet keeping, says that we shouldn't think of the category as pets as limited to just certain species or just the ones that like live in our homes, that actually more and more all animals all around the planet are becoming sort of more like a pet in the sense that they're now really dependent on us because we have endangered them so severely. So, you know, I think that line, for better or for worse, between, you know, sort of domestic, you know, animals that live in human culture and the ones that are sort of out there in the wild is kind of disappearing. So,
and sorry to barge in. I'm from Romania, mountains, woods, and so on and so forth. I know since long ago, and to this day, the people who are in charge of protecting the forests, they provide food for animals during winter when food is so scarce. Just an example.
Yeah.
I wonder whether the people who want to have their animals cloned have children, or whether this is some form of seeking continuity that you can't have. I mean, when you have your own kids, I look at a lot of my friends and they are absolutely besotted with their grandchildren. I think much more than with their own children, really. And I think that's got something to do with a form of immortality that you're going on into the next generation.
Yeah, or maybe just that it's a lot easier to be really nice to your grandkids because you don't have to live with them all the time. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I feel like there's something, I don't know what it's almost like it's inordinate. The people who are so completely devastated by the loss of their pet, and it's not because I don't think that pets deserve that kind of, you know, a bond and affection, but there just seems something disordered about these people and the way that they think about their pets, you know, that it would actually seem legitimate to you to just try to remake them.
Yeah, I had a conversation or an exchange with Lisa a few days ago because I actually had somebody whose daughter is anorexic and suicidal, and she lost a pet cat and was absolutely devastated by it. And I wondered whether, you know, you could say, well, cloning that cat for her, and Lisa picked it up. Could you say it was a medical treatment? And therefore you could justify it because it would be treating, you know, some condition.
But maybe anyone who wants to clone their pet has a condition that needs to be treated. You know? Like maybe that's just something wrong with those people. Peter has had his hand up, I think.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think whether it's the antithesis to cruelty to animals, that you love them so much you want them forever, as compared with, you know, are you expressing hate probably in cruelty to an animal,
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your your wisdom on this issue. I think my question or comment is related to the motivation for people wanting to clone pets. And I think this is sort of the emotional dimension, I suppose. No, I mean, I think the rational dimension, I think you covered really well. And but I think that why do people feel the need to want to clone something? I think that's I think it relates more to the emotion, the sense of the loss or grief or whatever else, than to any sort of rational reason. I think that's so. I'm just wondering, have you? I think in a way you've covered this in the last few comments, but I'm just wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a very irrational impulse. I mean, even people who are told, or understand that they're not getting back the same thing that they lost. I think that there's a kind of wishful thinking, or wish fulfillment, this idea that somehow, but still, if you just bring back something of that thing that's gone, like something miraculous will happen.
Mm.
Person who believes that like the soul of his previous pets will sort of enter the body of these new animals, which is interesting because it's for a person who believes apparently that animals have these distinct souls, which is usually kind of the dividing line between how people think about, in some way, the reason that people object to cloning, even if they don't say that it's because humans have a soul, there's something like that they're thinking that makes humans kind of distinct. And it seems interesting to me that someone would understand or would believe that their animals have like a unique soul and would think that somehow the way to bring it back is a genetic technology,
Lisa, it's interesting though, because on the cat sites, when a cat dies, the most frequent comment is that let's say Charlie has gone over the Rainbow Bridge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and which implies that they've gone on somewhere else.
Yes, but I understand that the cloning is bringing about a new life. It's not actually reproducing an old life. I mean, you just can't as you say, you can't transfer a soul into a new being because it's a distinct and unique creature.
It's just so strange. It's like you're replacing a part in a, you just insert the soul into this body.
Anyway, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's not actually correct, because what they've found with the clone animals is that they have the same age as the cell that was used to clone them. So if you get yourself cloned at 65, your clone will have the same cell age.
Yeah, so I mean, if people's pets have lived a fairly long life before they died, if they didn't die young in an accident or something, then you're putting these cells in that are from a cat or a dog or whatever. It's,
So if you're intending to clone your pet, you best take a cell sample from when the pet's young, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. Because the cells have what they call telomeres on the end of them. Yes. And as you age, the telomeres drop off. And the guys who make it to 120, they've very stable telomeres.
Right.
Yeah. And so you've got to be careful. Get yourself cloned young.
Oh, it's okay. Too late.
Okay, so we are out of questions, it seems, and we are about to reach the limit of our session. So many answers and so many questions. I'm so grateful for the wisdom that you share with us, Lisa and Margot. Also, I'm grateful for the audience, and the thoughtful comments are definitely contact Lynn to ask some questions. That was a very detailed and complex comment. And before we part ways, it is with great humility that I acknowledge once again Neil Ormrod's presence here. Neil has initiated the TRN group, Theology Research Network. He has worked tirelessly towards setting up this whole phenomenon, so to speak, which was much more successful, I have to say, under his leadership than mine. It is good to see him and so many other friends of TRN here. I'm also expressing my heartfelt gratitude towards Jackie Liu, my colleague from ISCAS, who has helped me tremendously through this year. I'm saying these things because this is our last session this year. Hopefully, we'll resume next year with fresh ideas. Once again, thanking Lisa and Margot and all of you. I will salute you in the Sydney language, Darug, Didgerigura Yana Janawi, which means thank you for walking with me. And God willing, see you next year. Until then, Godspeed. All the best.